In 1858, the regular army of the Russian Empire opened fire on its own citizens. The charge was completely unprecedented. The citizens were shot for refusing to drink vodka. The state sent infantry units with loaded rifles to force peasants into taverns. They beat them with rifle butts for the crime of staying sober. Sobriety was officially classified as a state rebellion. This sounds like a cheap dystopian thriller. It is actually the skeleton key to understanding how one of the largest empires in human history collapsed. History books blame the 1917 revolution on abstract ideologies, bread shortages, and a disastrous world war. The real murder weapon is hiding in the Imperial Treasury ledgers. At the very end of this investigation, I'll show you one specific line from the final balance sheet, a single entry that proves the empire was financially dead long before the first shot of the revolution was fired. The crime scene is the Russian countryside. The year is 1858. A massive rebellion erupts across 32 provinces. This is a highly organized financial strike. Hundreds of thousands of peasants simply stop drinking. They boycott the taverns entirely. The movement shifts fast. Quiet refusal turns into religious fanaticism. Crowds gather in the muddy town squares. They march directly to the local Orthodox churches. They take sacred vows of sobriety. Local priests write up the formal pledges. A peasant signs his name. He scratches his mark into the paper. He swears off hard liquor forever. Breaking that specific vow becomes a mortal sin. It carries a heavier social weight than breaking a marriage oath. The local taverns empty out. The heavy copper coins stop clinking into the wooden lockboxes. Then, the quiet strike turns kinetic. The crowds move from the church steps to the tavern doors. They bypass the loot entirely. They want absolute destruction. Mobs smash the wooden stalls to splinters. They drag the heavy oak barrels out into the streets. They stave them in with axes. Cheap rye vodka spills instantly into the dirt. They call the ritual baptizing the earth. They pour the state's primary revenue stream directly into the local rivers. It is a highly visible symbol of cleansing the commune. The surviving taverns are quickly boarded up. Angry mobs nail the windows shut with heavy planks. The pathology of this revolt is deeply strange. The original spark was pure economic friction. The peasants were reacting to the brutal reality of the autopsy system. This was a viciously efficient tax farming mechanism. Private contractors leased the exclusive right to sell vodka in a specific region. They paid the crown a massive upfront fee. To make their profit, they squeezed the villages dry. They diluted the vodka with water. They laced it with toxic additives to keep the kick. They ran predatory loan schemes right over the bar counter. The crowds initially gathered to demand cheaper prices. They wanted stronger liquor. Then the psychology of the mob fractured. A demand for a discount mutated into a holy war. By 1859, the mobs are cornering local governors. They demand absolute local prohibition. They want the tavern keys handed over to the village commune. They want the liquor trade eradicated. The social hierarchy of the village turns upside down overnight. The village pariah is no longer the town drunk sleeping in a ditch. The ultimate outcast is the loyalist. The man walking into the Tsar's tavern to buy a state-stamped bottle becomes the enemy. Contemporary memoirs note a brutal shift in public contempt. Public anger zeroes in completely on anyone funding the crown. A man could be drunk from his own hidden stash. The village would look away. Buying state vodka makes you a traitor to your own neighbors. In St. Petersburg, the Ministry of Finance panics. A sober peasant is a fiscal nightmare. The state relies heavily on the vodka trade. It funds the sprawling army. It lays railroad tracks across frozen wasteland. It keeps a bloated bureaucracy functioning. If the peasantry stays sober, the empire defaults. The state apparatus immediately treats the temperance movement as a terror cell. Internal police reports classify the sobriety circles as suspicious societies. They are labeled as gatherings to incite the masses. Refusing a drink is officially documented as disobedience to state business. Destroying a tavern is a direct physical attack on the crown's monopoly. The government responds with maximum absurd force. They deploy the regular military to suppress the outbreak of sobriety. Infantry battalions are ordered to force the taverns open at gunpoint. Soldiers herd peasants toward the drinking houses with fixed bayonets. They flog men in the public squares. Their only crime is boycotting the cash register. The military operation itself is a chaotic mess. In remote counties, the soldiers arrive and look at the smashed taverns. They immediately join the peasants in looting the remaining stockpiles. They drain the surviving barrels dry. Then they remember their orders. They form up ranks. They violently arrest the very people they just drank with. The Imperial Army functions as both the vanguard of the riot and its executioner. A persistent rumor runs beneath these official reports. Corrupt local officials quietly encourage the peasant boycotts. They use the violent mobs as leverage. They want to terrify the private tax farmers. The bureaucrats squeeze the frightened contractors for better bribes. They secure more favorable lease terms for the state. The peasants believe they are fighting for their eternal souls. The bureaucrats use mob violence to renegotiate a commercial lease. The military's own relationship with the bottle reveals deep hypocrisy. The Tsarist government frequently launches localized anti-alcohol campaigns. They ban vodka sales in garrison shops to maintain discipline. At the exact same time, military quartermasters issue pure spirit. They distribute it directly from state warehouses. They log it officially as medicine and a cure for the cold. The empire strictly requires its soldiers to be brave. It desperately requires its peasants to be drunk. Why is the state so hypersensitive to a few boarded-up taverns? You have to follow the ledger. Booze isn't an incidental tax. It is the core operating system of the empire. A bizarre paradox emerges from the fiscal data. The more financially unstable the empire becomes, the more voluntary sobriety movements spring up among the poorest classes. It is a direct inverse relationship. The poorest citizens map their sobriety precisely to the treasury's deficits. By the dawn of the 20th century, the numbers become fatal. In 1900, the total budget of the Russian Empire sits at roughly 1.5 billion gold rubles. The revenue extracted purely from vodka makes up about 28% of that entire treasury. Read that twice. The state extracts nearly a third of its global budget over a wooden bar counter. By 1913, the system is fully modernized. Finance Minister Sergey Witte establishes a massive state monopoly. The underlying financial addiction remains exactly the same. The empire pulls in 899 million rubles purely from alcohol sales. That is 26% of all state revenue. The state abandons the private middleman completely. This is direct, unadulterated profit from retail sales. The imperial government acts as the sole distiller, distributor, and merchant. Going into the fateful year of 1914, the projected budget relies heavily on this monopoly. The ledgers anticipate 936 million rubles from alcohol. The total expected state revenue is 3.57 billion rubles. A clean quarter of the empire's financial lifeblood flows directly from the bottle. For centuries, the empire survived by forcing its population to consume alcohol. The state literally could not afford a sober society. It proved that in 1858 by breaking the temperance movement with bullets and public whippings. The system functioned perfectly under a ruthless state monopoly. Half a century later, the state fundamentally forgets its own survival mechanism. On July 18, 1914, Emperor Nicholas II makes a catastrophic miscalculation. He issues a fateful decree. Local municipalities gain the right to close the liquor trade entirely. He wants a clean, highly disciplined military mobilization for World War I. He wants to avoid the drunken brawls that plague train stations during conscription. He believes a sober army will march faster to the front lines. A few weeks later, he takes the final step. He bans the sale of state vodka entirely. Subsequent emergency orders shut down private sales of anything over 16% alcohol. Even strong beer is aggressively outlawed across the provinces. By September 1914, the State Duma passes the first comprehensive dry law in Russian history. Loopholes certainly exist. Wine and denatured alcohol still flow through the back alleys, but the main financial artery is severed. The Tsar voluntarily turns off the tap. He cuts off a third of his empire's oxygen. He doesn't realize he just armed a fiscal bomb. The rioting peasants of 1858 knew instinctively that a sober Russia would bankrupt the state. It took the Tsar 50 years to learn the exact same lesson. The ledgers do not lie. The 1914 budget was highly specific. The empire expected roughly 3.57 billion rubles in total revenue. State vodka was programmed to deliver 936 million. That is over a quarter of the national income. In some regions, the dependency pushed past 30%. Historians accurately called it the Drunken Budget. The state essentially deleted its own foundation, overnight. Nicholas sought a spiritual awakening. He got a shattered economy instead. The timing defies basic logic. You do not amputate your primary financial artery during a global conflict. Consider the sheer scale of the lost money. Between 1906 and 1913, the state liquor monopoly generated a staggering surplus. It brought in over 5 billion gold rubles. 5 billion. That massive number requires context. Russia completely rebuilt its naval fleet after the Japanese War. That modern shipbuilding program cost 222 million rubles. Vodka paid for those new dreadnoughts 20 times over. Now the ultimate war was starting. The military needed millions of rifles. They needed endless artillery shells. The empire required every single kopeck. The Tsar signed the temperance decree anyway. The motivation was deeply ideological. The Tsar viewed the liquor monopoly as fundamentally immoral. He believed it was incompatible with national spiritual revival. Some historians suggest this was also a calculated propaganda move. The emperor wanted to project moral purity to his European allies. He wanted a focused nation ready for holy war. Finance Minister Pyotr Bark faced an absolute nightmare. Bark initially approached the dry law with extreme caution. He understood the lethal math. The emperor remained adamant about reform. The minister had to draft the 1915 budget from scratch. He had to do it without the traditional drunken revenues. He had to finance a mobilized war economy with missing billions. The fiscal gap was insurmountable. The treasury began bleeding out immediately. Official alcohol receipts went into free fall. The numbers tell a brutal story. The state collected roughly 545 million rubles from liquor in 1914. That was mostly before the ban took effect. By 1917, that vital number collapsed to a mere 95 million. That is an 80% crash in 3 short years. The government panicked. They scrambled wildly to plug the hole. They took out massive foreign loans. They issued domestic bonds. Finally, they resorted to the oldest trick. They started printing money. Paper money flooded the streets. The ruble lost its purchasing power rapidly. Inflation accelerated into hyperinflation. The state traded a stable drunken economy for a bankrupt sober one. The war effort demanded constant funding. The missing third of the budget haunted every strategic decision. The treasury simply could not pay for adequate supplies. The military logistics network fractured under the immense financial strain. The Prohibition was originally pitched as a temporary military measure. It was supposed to last exactly 2 weeks, just long enough to get conscripts onto trains without riots. Nicholas wanted a clean mobilization. He wanted to avoid chaotic brawls at the railway stations. The army needed men moving quickly. But local authorities utilized their new emergency powers. The government formally banned vodka empire-wide in the autumn. They also handed local officials the right to ban beer and wine. They kept extending the restrictions indefinitely. A brief pause morphed into a permanent regime. It was a bizarre mosaic of rules. It became a semi-dry reality. State vodka was illegal everywhere, but beer and wine remained available in various provinces. The local authorities created massive regulatory loopholes. The sober mobilization was an administrative illusion. Yes, public street violence dropped significantly during the first month. Official crime statistics looked fantastic. The Tsar received glowing reports about a renewed national spirit. But human nature adapts fast. The underlying demand for alcohol did not vanish. It bypassed the state entirely. The government lost its lucrative monopoly to shadow operators. A massive illicit economy woke up. Villages fired up hidden stills. Moonshine flooded the countryside. Peasants used grain to brew illegal liquor. They consumed precious agricultural resources meant for bread. This illicit brewing undermined the food supply chain. Urban factory workers faced a darker reality. They turned to highly dangerous chemical alternatives. They drank denatured alcohol meant for industrial use. They consumed toxic technical fluids. Hospitals started recording strange casualties. Mass poisoning spiked dramatically across major industrial centers. The state sacrificed its largest revenue stream. It gained a massive public health disaster. Here is the lethal detail. The dry law was fundamentally asymmetrical. It targeted the lower classes with surgical precision. The state closed the monopoly shops completely. That cut off cheap vodka for the peasants. It cut off factory workers. But the new legislation contained massive loopholes for the elite. Upscale restaurants remained fully operational. High-end dining establishments kept their wine lists intact. Private clubs kept cellars stocked. Wealthy citizens faced no restrictions. They could still buy expensive vintage wine. They could freely order imported French champagne. The aristocracy continued drinking openly in the capital. The working class drank toxic furniture varnish in dark alleyways. This rigid division was not a minor oversight. It was a daily insult. The poor suffered forced sobriety under threat of arrest. The rich simply bought their way around the rules. That blatant hypocrisy bred a specific kind of class rage. The dry law created two completely different realities. The military elite toasted to the war effort with fine Bordeaux. The mobilized peasants went to the muddy trenches sober. The state demanded unimaginable sacrifices from the masses. At the exact same time, it removed their only social anesthetic. That fundamental inequality primed the powder keg perfectly. How did a wartime ban on liquor bankrupt the world's largest empire? The answer is hidden in the basic mechanics of imperial survival. Empires need staggering amounts of money to function. Collecting direct taxes across millions of square miles of frozen mud, dense forests, and isolated provincial villages is a severe logistical nightmare. You need an army of literate clerks. You need accurate land registries. You need dedicated enforcers to track down tax evaders in territories where paved roads barely exist. The Romanovs and the Rurikids before them found a brilliant, devastating shortcut. They realized early on that building a modern tax infrastructure for a sober population was nearly impossible. It was infinitely easier to empty the pockets of a drunk man. The official ledgers trace this financial strategy back to the very foundation of the centralized Russian state. In 1474, Ivan III established the first government monopoly on bread wine, the rough early predecessor to modern vodka. Private sales were shut down entirely across the territory. The crown claimed the exclusive, unassailable right to profit from the distillation and distribution of strong spirits. It was a blunt, primitive instrument that lasted only until 1533. Yet the fiscal DNA of the state was permanently locked into place. Fast forward to the reign of Ivan the Terrible. The crown introduces the Gosudarev Kabak, the sovereign's tavern. The state officially steps behind the bar. The government dictates the exact price of the liquor. Local administrators pour the drinks. You do not need a tax inspector when the taxpayer willingly walks into a dark, smoke-filled room and leaves his hard-earned wages on a sticky wooden counter. The local officials swept the copper coins straight into iron-strong boxes. Running a sprawling, continent-wide network of taverns eventually strained the medieval bureaucracy. The state needed guaranteed, predictable income without the daily administrative headache of managing thousands of individual bars. The solution was the otkup, the tax farming system. This was legalized extortion operating on a national scale. The government leased the right to collect liquor revenue to private contractors for a massive upfront cash payment. These contractors bought the right to tax a specific region. Acting as local warlords, they headed out into the provinces to recoup their immense investment and extract a profit. They artificially inflated prices. They watered down the grain spirit. They pushed consumption ruthlessly. Their personal fortunes depended entirely on squeezing every last kopeck out of the local peasantry. These contractors used highly effective, brutal tactics to force compliance. They created a permanent, volatile conflict between the crown's need for instant cash and the population's basic ability to survive. The contractors cared nothing for the social fabric of the villages. This aggressive extraction is exactly what sparked the massive tavern riots of 1648. The state had brilliantly delegated the physical violence of taxation to private hands. The government insulated itself from the dirty work, taking the guaranteed check while the tax farmers drained the rural economy dry. By the mid-19th century, the peasant anger reached a critical, dangerous threshold. The crown depended on the oat cup system for a massive chunk of its revenue, but the localized rebellions were becoming a severe security threat. The government dismantled the classic tax farming system in 1861 and pivoted to an excise model. Under these new regulations, anyone with a proper license could sell alcohol, provided the bottles bore official state tax stamps. Competition immediately drove retail prices down. Consumption climbed steadily across the provinces. The streets flooded with cheap, highly accessible liquor. The imperial treasury watched the overall turnover grow rapidly, but a disturbing trend emerged in the accounting books. The real profit margins were slipping away into the pockets of private distillers and tavern owners. The government was getting a reliable cut, but it was no longer taking the whole pie. That brings the timeline to Sergey Witte. As the powerful Minister of Finance in the 1890s, Witte looked at the excise system and saw a deeply flawed business model. He engineered the fourth state monopoly. The complex rollout began in 1894 and expanded across the empire by the early 1900s. I review the structural design of this reform, and the sheer efficiency is staggering. This new architecture was a fiscal masterpiece. Witte designed a tightly controlled, multi-tiered extraction machine. Private agricultural distillers produced raw alcohol for the government at a fixed, deliberately low procurement price. State-owned purification plants refined the raw product up to 96 degrees. Then, government factories bottled the final liquor. The Ministry of Finance dictated the retail price and sold the vodka exclusively through state-owned shops called monopolkas. These government stores operated under rigid regulations. Customers could only buy vodka to go. The bottles were sealed securely. The official government logic argued that a man carrying a sealed bottle home to his family was less likely to drink himself into a violent stupor than a man sitting in a rowdy, unregulated tavern. Witte publicly packaged the monopoly as a progressive public health initiative. The internal ledger books reveal a pure profit extraction engine. The state captured every single penny of margin from the grain harvest straight down to the consumer's mouth. The monopoly bottled the liquid in a wide spectrum of standardized sizes. You could purchase a massive 12.3-liter bucket for a large gathering. You could buy a standard 0.615-liter bottle. The state even produced a tiny 60-milliliter flask called a shikalik. The government meticulously ensured that every peasant, regardless of how devastatingly poor they were, could afford to contribute to the imperial treasury on any given day. The sheer volume of cash generated by this system created a phenomenon historians explicitly label the Drunken Budget. By 1900, the Witte monopoly provided nearly 30% of all imperial revenue. Out of a 1.5 billion gold ruble budget, alcohol generated the largest single share. The state recorded hundreds of millions of gold rubles in pure liquor revenue in the very first years of the new century. The paradox was blatant. From 1895 to 1901, The number of fatal alcohol poisonings actually dropped by nearly a quarter, allowing the state to claim a grand moral victory while swimming in unprecedented cash. The numbers only accelerated as the monopoly matured. By 1913, the state liquor monopoly generated a staggering 899 million rubles, accounting for roughly 26% of the budget. Look at the imperial budget projections for the fateful year of 1914. The total anticipated state revenue was 3.57 billion rubles. The state liquor monopoly was projected to account for 936 million of that total. More than a quarter of the entire state apparatus was funded directly by citizens buying state-issued grain spirit. Vodka served as the oil of the 19th century. The empire used this alcohol revenue to drag a vast medieval peasant society into the industrial age. The Trans-Siberian Railway was laid on a financial foundation of empty glass bottles. The military expansions, the massive bureaucratic machine, the glittering winter palaces, they all floated on a steady sea of state-distilled liquor. The average citizen drank about 3 liters of pure alcohol per capita annually in 1913. That is actually significantly lower than consumption rates in contemporary England. The average price of a liter sat around 68 kopecks. For a subsistence farmer, that was a heavy, noticeable financial burden. Drinking expensive state vodka transformed into a twisted marker of prestige and success in the rural villages. It proved you had disposable income to burn at the government shop. The imperial bureaucracy clearly understood the dual advantage of managing an intoxicated population. A high reliance on state-supplied vodka guaranteed tight, predictable fiscal control. It also efficiently lowered unwanted social and political activity. The monopoly was the perfect tax mechanism. The population paid it voluntarily on a daily basis. It required minimal administrative overhead compared to assessing property or agricultural yields. It brought in unimaginable wealth. Now return to Nicholas II in the 10th summer of 1914. The Tsar did not just ban a recreational beverage to improve military discipline among his troops. He took a sledgehammer to the primary engine of state finance. For 400 years, the Russian Empire had avoided building a modern comprehensive tax system because the liquor monopoly always covered the massive shortfalls. The state simply lacked the bureaucratic muscle to collect direct income taxes effectively. The monopoly was the tax system. When the Tsar signed the dry law, he shut down his own treasury. The government voluntarily vaporized nearly 30% of its operating budget, precisely when it needed to fund a devastating global war. The treasury bled out immediately. Pyotr Bark watched 1 billion projected rubles vanish from his 1914 ledger. He was the Minister of Finance. His job was to fund an apocalyptic war against 2 industrialized empires. His primary revenue stream was now highly illegal. By 1913, the state vodka monopoly generated roughly 26% of all state income. Some economic historians push that figure closer to 30%. It was the undisputed financial bedrock of the state. The government had no backup plan. They had to print money. Bark issued desperate foreign loans just to keep the lights on. The printing presses ran hot day and night. Hyperinflation began its steady, silent march through the economy. The physical money supply ballooned. The actual purchasing power of the paper ruble disintegrated. Examine the exact timeline of the suicide. On July 18th, Nicholas II granted local councils the authority to shut down liquor sales at their own discretion. By September, the State Duma authorized a blanket national ban. Order number 309 had already stripped alcohol from the lower military ranks back in May. The official rhetoric tied total sobriety directly to battlefield victory. The Tsar wanted a clean, disciplined military machine. The reality was an overnight criminal enterprise of unprecedented scale. The state monopoly shuttered its doors. The black market kicked them down. Pre-war Russia lacked a genuine epidemic of alcoholism. Annual per capita consumption sat around 3 liters. That was significantly lower than contemporary England. It was a fraction of modern consumption rates. Yet the Tsar panicked. He believed a sober peasantry would guarantee a swift victory. He completely misunderstood the mechanics of his own empire. The state lost a massive mountain of cash. It also lost its primary administrative tool. The dry law was heavily asymmetrical. The ban applied strictly to the working class. High society still bought Bordeaux. You could easily order fine champagne in upscale Petrograd restaurants. Private aristocratic clubs maintained their deep cellars. The working class got a wildly different menu. They drank denatured alcohol. They drank industrial furniture varnish. They drained bottles of cheap cologne. Toxic substitutes caused mass poisonings across major industrial centers. Urban hospitals filled with a brand new demographic of surrogate alcoholics. This hypocrisy bred a very specific, quiet fury. A factory worker drinking poison knew exactly what the aristocracy was sipping across town. In the countryside, the situation fractured completely. The rural villages quickly figured out illicit distillation. Samagon flooded the rural economy. Moonshine requires massive amounts of grain. Tons of precious agricultural yield vanished into illicit copper stills. The state was desperate for bread to feed the front line. The peasants were turning that bread into unregulated liquor. They sold it at extortionate markups. The provincial police could fine people for public intoxication. They could arrest a few unlucky bootleggers. They could not stop a shadow economy that encompassed the entire empire. The government had surrendered its most effective leash on the peasantry. Before 1914, the local tavern was a highly predictable state-controlled environment. The local official knew who was drinking. He knew exactly where the money was going. Now, the drinking happened in secret. The money vanished into the pockets of local black market operators. This is the core mechanical failure. The government monopoly previously channeled rural vice into imperial infrastructure. The dry law forced that vice underground. It weaponized the addiction. Brawls over technical alcohol turned fatal. Group murders over a bottle of cologne entered the provincial police reports. The state tried to intervene desperately. They formed pathetic local committees against youth alcoholism. They tried regulating daily behavior through harsh decrees. It was far too late. The social fabric was already rotting from the inside out. By late 1916, the system was tearing apart at the seams. Food supply chains collapsed entirely. The printed ruble was practically worthless. The people were sober enough to see the sheer incompetence of the imperial administration. They were angry enough to break it. February 1917 arrived. The streets of Petrograd exploded. The political uprising quickly mutated into an armed, violent binge. Mobilized soldiers and furious workers actively targeted the symbols of elite privilege. They stormed the government offices. They stormed the elite wine cellars. Mass wine pogroms swept the capital and the provinces. The anger was absolute. The Winter Palace held massive stores of vintage wines and spirits. The crowd tore into them. They smashed the ancient oak barrels. They hauled heavy crates into the blood-stained streets. Revolutionary guards tried to stop the looting. They understood the danger of a heavily armed, severely intoxicated mob. They formed special anti-alcohol detachments. They poured thousands of liters of expensive imported alcohol down the city sewers. It barely slowed the chaos. Memoirs from the February uprising describe barricades built out of stolen wine crates. Soldiers desperately tried to dynamite certain palace cellars just to keep the mob out. The proletariat was violently reclaiming the luxury they had been denied for 3 long years. The street violence was fueled by a toxic mix of stolen vintage cognac and raw class hatred. The imperial police force evaporated entirely. The military garrisons joined the looters. The safety valve had been welded shut in 1914. Now the boiler exploded. Return to that empty ledger. The final imperial budgets are a crime scene photograph. The empire was functionally bankrupt before the first red flag flew over the capital. The Romanov dynasty financed 4 centuries of expansion by acting as a giant unregulated bartender. Nicholas II finally closed the tab. He destroyed his own state. He removed the only steady revenue source keeping his government solvent. He removed the cheap narcotic keeping his population compliant. The Tsar bet the entire Russian Empire on a sudden vow of sobriety. The empire died of the withdrawal.